Now, as some of you may know, Benevolence Farm prioritizes and advocates for the use of person-first language, which we will be utilizing and demonstrating in tonight's panel. The idea of this kind of language, as the name implies, is to put the actual person first, not any one aspect of their identity. We always use phrases or words that include person or people or a subject's name or their fixed characteristics. And the title of the bill that we're discussing tonight is a great example of person-first language. It emphasizes that the women affected are at heart women and people, human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity. Next, for those of you who may not be familiar, just a quick overview of Benevolence Farm. We are a transitional employment and living program for women leaving the North Carolina carceral system. Our goal is to help give our residents time and space to make lasting changes in their lives. For more information about our program, we would love for you to visit our website, benevolencefarm.org. Now, before we dive into talking with our wonderful panelists, just a quick overview of what HB 608 is. So the first part of the legislation really deals with helping pregnant women who are incarcerated. It limits the use of restraints on pregnant women after their first trimester, during pregnancy, and through a 6-week postpartum period. It also limits the implementation of invasive searches and solitary confinement and requires that all nutritional and financial needs of the women be met by the Department of Public Safety. In addition to discussing the treatment of pregnant women, the bill also designates certain rights of incarcerated mothers after they've given birth. It designates a bonding time for the mother and child after delivery and requires that the Department of Public Safety provide any necessary postpartum hygiene products. In addition, it requires that mothers with a child under the age of 1 be placed in a facility within 250 miles of that child's home, and changes the visitation rules for children under that age to occur more frequently and with contact. Not only does this legislation address issues that pregnant women face while incarcerated, but it also changes aspects of the prison system that affect all women living there. For instance, it limits invasive inspections by male employees. It requires that enough menstrual products be available at every facility and are provided at no cost. And it creates an educational program that some employees must take on the physical and mental health and care of pregnant women. As I mentioned before, this bill passed unanimously through the House of the General Assembly back in May, and is making its way through the Senate. Now, with us tonight, we have 3 wonderful women who all have unique and valuable perspectives on this legislation that we are so excited to hear tonight. Representative Ashton Clemmons, Kristie Pucket-Williams, and Melissa Radcliff. Representative Ashton Clemmons was one of the primary co-sponsors of the Dignity for Women Who Are Incarcerated Act in the North Carolina House of Representatives. She was formerly an educator and is now serving her 2nd term as the representative for the 57th District in Guilford County. Next, Kristie Pucket-Williams is currently the statewide campaign for Smart Justice Manager for the ACLU of North Carolina. As a directly affected advocate, she's focused on the treatment of women, including pregnant women who are incarcerated. She's also been appointed by Governor Roy Cooper to serve as the chair of the Women in Incarceration Work Group for the State Reentry Council Collaborative. And finally, Melissa Radcliff is the program director of Our Children's Place, a statewide program here in North Carolina that is dedicated to supporting children with parents who are incarcerated or returning home. Their program focuses on educating people about the impact of having parents who are incarcerated or returning on children, identifying and advocating for policies and programs that address issues that children with incarcerated or returning parents face, and supporting relationships between children and their incarcerated parents. Before we dive into the substance of this legislation, I'm really curious as to how each of you came to be aware of the issues addressed in HB 608. Representative Clemmons, can we start with you?
Sure, I'm happy to speak briefly about that. I think Kristie's experience is more important to highlight here, but I'm a representative, as Ashley said, from Greensboro, and in my first term worked a lot on public education, but also was one of the primary sponsors of the Second Chance Act. And as a public school educator in schools with mostly low-income families, I saw firsthand the negative impacts of our justice system on many of our families and how small incidents can really destroy families. And I knew morally and economically that it was not the right thing. So second to supporting public education, I really have a deep passion for how we reform our criminal justice system. And in doing some of that work, I started to talk to many of the important advocates at the legislature. And this topic specifically was one that I felt was really critical and important. And Kristie has firsthand experience. I have been fortunate to hear from many women who have been pregnant and delivered. And it's important to note that this bill covers the DPS statewide system, but it also covers local county jails, which we had to work very, very hard to get support from our Sheriff's Association on that. And so this bill protects women and their children, both statewide and DPS custody, but also in local county jails, which is actually where many of our issues were happening with women who hadn't even been adjudicated yet. So there wasn't even a conviction and they were having experiences. So, you know, very long story short, from me, it was something I cared about, but I heard firsthand the stories of women who were brave to share those stories, like Kristie, and I knew it was something that was important to work on, and thankfully we were able to make a lot of good progress this session, and hopefully we will be getting it across the finish line soon.
Kristie, Representative Clemmons mentioned that you have firsthand experience with these issues. Would you be comfortable with sharing some of that with us tonight?
All right, sure. I would say that when I first entered into the system, I entered, as many women do, as a victim of violence. And so I was subjected to the carceral state and the coercive control of staff, being searched by male staff within the jail, invasive searches. I was a mother at the time as well, so I had a young son. And so the issue of visits, the lack of contact visits, the lack of just visits, period, more than once a week, was an issue that I became aware of in my incarceration. But in my subsequent arrest, when I was pregnant, I learned how truly vile this system is, because I thought surely being a pregnant person, being probably one of the weakest people inside of the system, the most vulnerable, I would say, you would have thought that there would have been accommodations made, and there were not any accommodations made for my pregnancy. I was just supposed to exist in a space and get along the best way I knew how. But that's just like every single other person that was there, pregnant or not. And so I received no prenatal care the entire time that I was there, and I was there for many months. And I took a plea deal, as many people do, just to get out. And 5 days later, I had a set of twins. And I had no idea I was having twins. And so it was like this, you know, not just a shock, but, you know, the scramble of having been through this high-risk pregnancy with no care. And I guess it's, in some ways, it's better to not have known how high risk it was, because my blood pressure probably would have shot up even more with anxiety. But it shouldn't have to be guesswork. How you're treated during pregnancy shouldn't be something we have to legislate, excuse me, but unfortunately it is. And so that's how I became aware of what was happening, just by experiencing it myself and then watching it happen to so many other people besides me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Melissa, what about you? How did you come to be aware of the issues addressed in this legislation?
Yeah, so first, Ashley, thanks to you and Benevolence Farm for doing this tonight, pulling it together, and thanks to all of you who made time in your evening to be part of this. We appreciate it. So our Children's Place, I won't bore folks with all the details, but when we were formed, gosh, about 16 years ago, the goal was to create a residential facility that would allow pregnant women to be able to live with their children once they gave birth. So women who were incarcerated would not be serving their sentence at a DPS facility. They would still be incarcerated, but they would be serving at an alternative location. And so I really knew nothing about the issue when I first joined our Children's Place as the executive director, but learned pretty quickly. And I think for me, learned a lot very quickly, but anytime you mention to a group, in particular a group of women, the possibility of being shackled while giving birth, it just horrifies people. You tell by the facial expression, the look in their eyes, especially any women who have given birth, who've said, really? Was someone trying to escape? Like, why do we even still have that? And that stuck in my mind repeatedly. So our Children's Place has gone a slightly different path, focused on both moms and dads who are in prison and their kids. But still, was really one of the things that got us started, was making sure and looking at how women who are pregnant or have just given birth, what's in place or not in place for them. So we were pretty excited when we heard this bill was being introduced and that it moved forward so quickly. And we also have our fingers crossed it's going to get over the finish line sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Representative Clemmons, Melissa just mentioned how quickly this bill passed through the House, and I mentioned earlier it was passed unanimously. I was wondering, what are your colleagues, either in the House or the Senate, saying about this bill? What are their kind of feelings on it?
Yeah, I mean, I love that that's like the outward perception, because the amount of hours that we spent behind the scenes for that to be what it looks like is tremendous. We started the session, quite frankly, being told that this bill was not going to go anywhere this session. And for whatever policy differences we may have on other topics, I give a lot of credit to Representative Kristen Baker, who's a Republican woman that I primary sponsored the bill with in the House, and Senator Amy Galey, a woman actually from Alamance County, where you all are. The three of us did hours and hours and hours and hours of conversations, specifically with the Department of Public Safety and the Sheriff's Association, and the thousands of hours spent in totality from a variety of advocates, but most importantly, ACLU and the North Carolina OBGYN Society and their lobbyists. They literally talked to every single representative in the House. And so we had a unanimous vote, but even right before the vote on the floor, I was having a conversation with someone who was challenging some of the language we were using and that kind of thing. And so I expected him to vote against it and to speak against it. But we got to a good agreement on where we were. So I am optimistic. I mean, it is, to go from starting the session thinking that the bill was not really going to go anywhere to getting a unanimous vote in the House is like tremendous. And I have a picture from the press conference in my office, because we literally had Kristie and the ACLU all the way up to Sheriff Terry Johnson, who I think is one of the more conservative sheriffs of our state, speaking for the same thing, and all the way in between. And that was from a tremendous amount of work and courage and storytelling. So we are optimistic. I think we're a little bit in a stalemate on all bills moving because of the budget discussion at the General Assembly, but I do believe that this bill will be moving forward in the Senate, and hopefully we'll all be able to celebrate a bill signing before too long.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely be watching it as it moves through the Senate. Kristie, Representative Clemmons just mentioned how the ACLU was active in lobbying for this legislation, and I'm sure you were active in advocating for it. How does it feel to see this bill being passed, both as someone who's advocated for it and as someone who has lived the experience that it is addressing?
As with all things related to the criminal legal system, I would say it's bittersweet, because for as sweet as it is, it still doesn't address the underlying conditions that force people into the carceral state. And so while I am excited that women or people who are pregnant and menstruating will have a better experience while being incarcerated, it is still very bitter that they are being subjected to incarceration to address many of the social, political, and economic issues that lead to their incarceration. And the harm, the trauma that led me into incarceration was only compounded and by that incarceration. So I think of that. But I'm to be honest, I'm very happy. I'm very proud to know that this was going absolutely nowhere in the beginning. And now it's actually probably going to pass with unanimous support from both chambers, not just at the DPS level, which is a whole nother issue, but in all 100 counties. And so, this really opens the opportunity up for us to create a floor, as opposed to this being, as my colleague Liz Barber said, the ceiling. This is a floor that we have created for the conditions of incarceration for people in general. And so I'm very proud, but it's always tempered with the fact that there are still people who are languishing in a cage and who won't ever get to have these experiences based on the way that we incarcerate folks right now.
Thank you. And then Melissa, I know you come from this a little bit of a different perspective, focusing a lot on children. Could you tell us a little bit about how you think that this bill will help children with incarcerated parents specifically?
Yeah, I mean, like Kristie, I feel like this is good, and gosh, it's taken this long to make it happen. The reality is, I present to professionals all across the state, and the number one response I get is, I have never thought about children of incarcerated parents. It's not that I don't care, it's that nobody's ever asked me to think about children of incarcerated parents. So one of the things I'm taking from this bill is that we had lots of folks, I watched that press conference, there were a lot of folks standing up there who probably prior to this work weren't thinking about children of incarcerated parents, right? They were thinking, we locked up the bad people, they're in our jails and our prisons, we're done. And then somebody said, oh wait, lots of them have kids, or they're going to have kids. And what does that mean for kids? So I love that it's a floor, it's not a ceiling, but it's hopefully a jumping off point to say, okay, this is amazing. We're going to celebrate it. And then what's next? How do we move forward from this piece? Because it can't be the end of it. I mean, there are 17,000 children in the state who have a parent in a DPS facility. That needs to change for a variety of reasons. I will say that the other piece that I do look at, like, yay, thumbs up, is that it includes our jails. We're a society that uses jail and prison interchangeably, and they're two different experiences. They're two different birds, and they create two different experiences for families. So the fact that we're having that conversation on both ends or sides, whatever, that we're talking jails and prisons, I think makes it a more complete conversation, because it means we can get folks involved on our local level, right? To say what is happening in your community, not in some DPS facility that you don't know about, but the jail that you drive by every day on your way to work, or taking the kids to school, or whatever the case may be. So I think it holds a lot of promise looking at it from the child perspective, but it also is the start of the conversation, is by not any stretch the end of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And on that note of a floor, not a ceiling, and what's next, I just wanted to ask all of you, I know it's a big question that we probably can't cover everything tonight, but what do you guys see as the next step, the next big issue that needs to be addressed once this bill is, hopefully, knock on wood, passed in the Senate. Maybe Kristie, can we start with you?
Ooh, I could go all day about what we could change. I mean, every single policy, the way we orchestrate and regulate our systems, and when I think about it, it's not just jails and prisons, right? I think about the way we have formulated and shaped domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, treatment facilities, mental health facilities. All of them are carceral in nature. And so how do we undo some of that? And I think we have to become less risk focused and more needs focused. We are constantly assessing folks' lethality and their risk without ever assessing like what are the needs. And if we meet those needs, how does that mitigate some of that risk and how does that mitigate some of that lethality? And so, but the things that I would like to see happen, of course, number one, we shouldn't use incarceration to address harm in the community. People need access to education while they're sitting there inside of those spaces. We need reentry resources, a more holistic understanding, to Melissa's point, of what does parenting look like while incarcerated, whether that is in a prison or in a jail in your local community. What is the food? What is the quality of that food? In this bill, we address some nutrition, but it doesn't go far enough. I could describe to you the gruel, and that's what I'm going to describe it as, gruel that we are serving people to eat inside. It's not even about being satiated or satisfied with what you're eating. It is literally about the nutritional components of the food, not having access to fresh fruits and vegetables. And what does that do to a person eating off the commissary every single day of chips and candies and snacks? And, what does that do to their health? And how does that exacerbate, the reentry process, or just exacerbate the prison system not being able to address their medical needs? Medical needs is a huge thing. Regular access to good medical care. And one of the most basic things is free telephone calls. And increased visitation. The barriers to folks remaining connected to the community. Studies have shown that if you have a discipline, and I'm gonna say discipline in quotations, inside of a carceral facility, that if you increase the person's connection to the community, that the behaviors that land them in the hole or any other detention process or administrative process of punishment inside of that facility is mitigated by phone calls and visits. So rather than taking away phone calls and visits in order to gain compliance, we should be increasing those things to foster compliance behind the wall. And those are just a few of the things, but we just have to stop looking at incarceration as the catch-all for the people in our communities who behave in a way in which we have decided is unacceptable or harmful, and recognize that harm is historical. We have not always used incarceration as a way to address harm, and that since we have used incarceration to address harm, we still have not seen a decrease in the harm in our communities. And so maybe it's time for, as the Campaign for Smart Justice says, to be smart about how we pursue justice.
Absolutely. Melissa, I know that your organization does a lot of advocacy for policies that help children, including this policy. What do you see as an important issue to address further than this legislation to help children with parents who are incarcerated or returning?
So I think it's advocacy, both legislative and otherwise, right? Like, let's get our schools to start thinking about this. What is social services saying about it? Our healthcare system, like, make this really a community conversation. That whole "it takes a village" thing, I think, applies here, which includes what's happening with legislation, but it's much broader than that. I think one of the conversations has to be, let's not forget about dads, right? We have lots of dads sitting in our jails and prisons, and we have disregarded and said, well, you're not the primary caregiver, therefore you don't count, right? You don't live with the kids, you don't see them 24/7, you don't count. And what's so ironic is that we started out as a program focused on incarcerated moms, and we actually have done more work with incarcerated dads. So thinking about making sure we're broadening that conversation. And again, that's across the board. That's with our bills that pass, what's happening with DPS and our jails, and it's also what's the community conversation. And then I think in terms of next steps with potential legislation is, are we looking at what some of the other states are doing around primary caregiver sentencing that's in place? And how are we defining primary caregiver? And are we looking at, as Kristie said, some alternatives to incarceration? Do we automatically default to incarceration? Or is there something else that should be in place in addition to addressing, as she has said, so many of the other social issues that are not being addressed as well?
Absolutely. And Representative Clemmons, I know legislating is a long process with a lot of compromise, but what are your top issues if you got to have your way? What do you see as the biggest things that need to be addressed from here?
So I think what you've heard are the biggest issues. I would also say there are people like Daniel Bowes and Liz Barber who are on this call who like this is their life's work. So my job as a legislator, I feel, is to rely on people like them and advocates like Kristie to help me understand what the next work is. From that, I will say a few things I see. One is we have to, so I think about it, Kristie referenced like re-entry, and we really have to think about whether you're coming at it from a moral perspective or an economic perspective. Our system is not working for people, and it is not working for the economy of our state, period. And so we really have to think about what people are doing when they are in prison, but what our system, I mean, we continue to punish people over and over and over and over and over and over and over again when they get out. And I saw that firsthand with some mentoring I did with a gentleman who had a commuted drug sentence, who had driven a dump truck before he went in. And then when he came out, that's all he wanted to be able to do was drive a dump truck and provide for his family. And he owed $682 in fines at the DMV, which might as well have been $8 million for him. And so that was preventing him from being able to get his license. And then he was in a halfway home. He got a job, but it was a third shift job. And the bus didn't work at the hours that he needed to be able to ride the bus. So he couldn't go to the job. I mean, you guys, he was trying everything he could, and he had my husband and I were really like helping through the process, which is so overwhelming. And I just watched like how many barriers we put up. So like we really have to think about why we continue to punish people when they have already served their sentence, and who we think that is serving. So the second thing I think that is tied to that, still this question of morality and economics. We filed a bill. Second look legislation is like a new kind of, or something that's happening in some other states. DC passed it. But basically, after people who have served 10 years, there's a whole list, and we could define it different ways. But basically, if people have gone into prison or jails and have been incarcerated for an extended period of time, particularly if they're crimes were 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, like when they are young, they go in, they have this list of rehabilitation opportunities, no infractions, quote unquote, which I think has to be unpacked, as Kristie referenced, but nothing has happened. Like, what are we serving by then sitting in jail for another 8 to 10 or 15 years? I just, it's not economically right. It's not morally right. And there's actually this group from Nash Correctional who read the bill, and these gentlemen have they've spent their time to call me and some of the other bill sponsors, and 4 of us are going to meet with them in a few weeks. And I really think that needs to be part of what we're pushing for moving forward. So as people are out, do we continue to punish them? But also when they have served time that has deeply impacted their life and shown that they're ready to contribute to society, what spiritual belief or what economic belief would keep them in prison? It hurts my heart. And I talk to these men who spend their phone call to call me, and it really is humbling, because I just take to heart, like, how do I take their stories and tell it in a way that can get some progress? So those are some specific things, looking at reentry and then second look legislation as well. I could say a lot more, but I think those are just kind of top of mind.
Absolutely, yeah. Melissa, you mentioned that this bill, or you mentioned that fathers are a big thing that are frequently overlooked when looking at incarcerated parents. And I think one of the criticisms of this bill is that it does the same thing. It only applies to mothers. But more than that, it only applies to children under the age of 1. Obviously, I think your organization and you would advocate for that to be a higher age, or probably no age at all. But what are some other criticisms that you think maybe this bill doesn't address as well?
Yeah, so the father's piece is something that, you know, obviously we would love to say it includes both moms and dads. The 1-year-old limit, you know, I just think about, you know, what happens at a year and a day, right? Like suddenly that's no longer an option. The distance piece, and maybe somebody else, one of the other panelists can answer that, but I'm not entirely sure that 250 miles helps, because I don't know what it is right now. So that would be kind of a question I would just have in terms of that. And then it's even things like, you know, it says that prison staff gets to decide if it would be unsafe for the child to be there. And I would just want to make sure it was somebody who knows about child safety, who understands, like, what does it mean to not be safe for a child to be there with mom? Like, what does that look like? And then I guess the other piece is just, I'm going to play devil's advocate, is I think the bill is written that visits can happen, at least twice a week. So does that mean we can do 7? Right? Like, I want to know where we can push the boundaries on this. Is it twice a week means 2 days, or twice a week means once in the morning, once in the afternoon, or can we do it 7 times a week? So I guess some of it is just kind of the logistics and how they may work out, but just some things to think about in terms of things moving forward. And as we've, I think, all agreed, continuing the conversation, building on that floor to say there are some tweaks that probably could enhance this going forward.
Mm-hmm. And Representative Clemmons, could you speak a little bit to the intent of the at least twice a week, and maybe talk a little bit about why, if you know, why the age of 1 was kind of the cutoff that was decided in the bill?
Yeah, I mean, when we filed the bill, it was all children 18 and under. Like, I mean, so without going through every conversation, legislation is a collaborative compromise process. It just is. And you know, being a member of the minority party, I will almost always have more that I think should be happening in the legislation that we're passing. So, you know, and we also started with including fathers. And as Melissa has talked about, like, the number of fathers that we would be talking about is like many multiples of the number of mothers that we're talking about, unfortunately, because of all the statistics we already know about incarceration. And so, you know, both of those, the age, the fathers, the distance was a big thing. We tried to figure out different ways to just, you know, to do that. And so those were all kind of just, we put out originally what our wish list was, and then we had to negotiate from there. And like all things, you know, I think we have to push and get as very much as we can. But I always believe it's better to take steps 1, 2, and 3 while still pushing for 4 and 5, than to shut it down because we don't get 4 and 5. So definitely there is much work to do. But I also want to point out that the visits are contact visits, because that's a big difference from what's happening. I visited the women's facility in Raleigh, and I went in the visitation rooms, and I met with some women who gave birth and are now in for life, and I heard their stories. And like, if you saw the visitation rooms that women are using now, and then you knew that the 2 visits a week at least are contact visits, like, that's a very big difference. And they're having to create structures for that. There is not a structure for contact visits. And so actually, this was one of our biggest sticking points. I'm really proud we were able to get it, even though it's not what we want. It's just 1 year and all those things. I'm actually really proud we still got to keep that part in.
And Kristie, Melissa just mentioned a second ago a little bit about how the bill does leave a lot of leeway for the actual employees of the facility. And I just was wondering, with your lived experience, having lived there, if you have any concerns about maybe that leeway, leaving room for loopholes, or in the worst case, corruption around using that.
I mean, the opportunity for people to not comply is always going to exist, right? The discretion is double-edged, right? So it allows discretion too, but it also allows discretion, but it leans on not doing that thing, right? And so, medically, there are no circumstances that physicians could think of that would require that a pregnant person be shackled. Like, we've talked to physicians, there's not a scenario in the world that they can think of, but we're also dealing with 100 sheriffs and DPS staff that have safety concerns. And so, to Rep. Clemmons' point about, we started out with this golden bill, but also had to compromise. And one of that compromise was to allow discretion to remain with the staff, right? But this bill doesn't just stop there, right? There still has to be oversight and monitoring and compliance. And so we will still be monitoring the situation. We will still be looking and investigating to see that jails and prisons are complying with this. And then if there are issues that bubble up, we will address those in the ways in which we historically have. So, we can organize and mobilize people around that. We can introduce legislation, or we can do what the ACLU tends to do very well, just send you a very threatening letter. And if you don't respond to that letter, then we have to escalate and ratchet up as appropriate through litigative measures. And so, yes, it does do that. But, historically, the norm has, and the status quo has been, to be punitive and carceral, right? And so we recognize that this is the start of a culture shift within carceral facilities. And it will not happen overnight. That abolition is an incremental practice. It's an incremental strategy. And so I'm okay with where it is. It's not where I would like it to be, definitely not. But what in this world is, but I can sleep at night with this. I'll say that. But I'm also going to be hyper vigilant when an incarcerated person reaches out and says, hey, this thing is still happening to me. So I won't be like, oh, well, we passed the bill and I don't know what you're going to do now, girl. And we're not going to do that either. So, we will still be monitoring and trying to ensure that the civil rights and civil liberties of all people in North Carolina are continued to be protected.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for staying vigilant on that. I think we can move into some audience questions if you guys are okay with that. I know we have some lined up. We have a few that were already submitted with the Zoom registration, so we can start with those. One of the questions is, what can we do to make local sheriffs and their staffs treat women with respect and dignity? Maybe we can start with Melissa.
I was hoping Kristie was going to take that one. Yeah, so I think part of it is, knowing who your elected officials are, who the folks who are running the show. Like, is there, are you in a small community where maybe it's your sheriff, but maybe in a bigger community it's your jail administrator? I mean, I feel like we're still learning a lot about that as well, in terms of even what services are being provided. Yeah, so I feel like I'm not the best person to answer that question, in terms of, I know what some of the things that we've tried, but I'm not sure that it's something that would put out to the whole group. So I think I'm going to defer to someone else for that question.
Kristie, do you want to speak a little bit to what we could do to help promote people treating women with respect and dignity?
Ooh, well, yeah. So number one, you would have to internally decide that women and people who are incarcerated are worthy of dignity and humanity. And then once you've made that decision, that declaration in your mind, then you have to seek out groups like the ACLU, Forward Justice, Emancipate NC, all the groups who are working to disrupt and interrupt the carceral system, Benevolence Farm, Down Home NC, supporting those groups, getting on their email lists, taking the actions. When we send a petition in an email, y'all, we're not just sending a petition in an email just to be sending a petition in an email. It's literally so that those signatures can be shown to people in power, to show that we have the public support that is needed for them to not even take the risk. They see it as risky. Your elected officials, for the most part, see criminal justice as a risk because they have subscribed and been indoctrinated with the most harmful people are incarcerated right now. And they've been sold a lie. There are people who really believe that the only people who are incarcerated right now are really, really bad people, murderers and rapists only. And they don't understand that anyone who is poor, who is Black, who is disenfranchised is at risk for being locked up in the state. And so we have to do education, our deep internal work, number one, but then be willing to engage and follow the leadership of directly impacted people. Run up on your sheriff. Ask him, hey, are pregnant people being allowed to breastfeed or pump and dump? Do they have pumps in there? What are you doing? Do they have a refrigerator where mothers can, just ask questions. Oftentimes what we see is they haven't even thought of those things. They don't know. A sheriff, is an administrator. They're not a jailer. He's generally not inside of that jail every day seeing what's happening. So there are times that we found out that the sheriff didn't even know it was a thing. Oh, that's a thing. And so using your voice to reach out to those folks who are in positions of power. But as it relates to DPS, it is going to take Governor Cooper and Attorney General Josh Stein and those people who are at the top of the food chain to start cracking down on the administrators of these facilities at DPS that they have control over. They like to distance themselves and act like they don't have much control over DPS, but Governor Cooper is the head of the state. If you don't have control over DPS, then Governor Cooper, who does? You know what I mean? And so I think those types of things, I would suggest also joining the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. They are a national network that historically has been focusing on the treatment of incarcerated women across the country and have great ways that folks can plug in on the national level, but also on the local level.
Can I just add, Ashley, that, well, first of all, there is one female sheriff in North Carolina, one. So that's just a factual difference, right? Because I've had children and I know what that is like as a woman. And so there's just that fundamental you have not experienced it. So I think just owning that. But I do want to say that through this process, the Sheriff's Association really worked with us. And part of the bill is that the Department of Public Safety is creating training and resources for people in DPS and county facilities to know about pregnancy, the impacts of restraints on pregnant women, and to offer a training course that every jail will be able to use and will use. And we worked with the sheriffs on that. They said, because originally it was each place had to come up with their own training, and they were like, that doesn't make sense because DPS will have more access to the resources. Can they make the training and resources and then share them with all of our facilities or jails across the state? So we must stay vigilant and on top of it, but I'm also optimistic that was the conversation. We want this, we don't want to all have to develop our own. How do we share that? So I hope and want to believe that there will be progress in that area.
Absolutely. And it's great to hear that the people involved in this are also looking to make change. We have another question. It appears that HB 608 requires appropriate health care for pregnant women. How do you identify the healthcare providers? Are contracts set up? Do you need volunteers? Have any of the NC health systems made commitment to providing that? Maybe Representative Clemmons, could you speak a little bit to that?
I can speak from my perspective, but Kristie may have additional information. My understanding, so So Department of Public Safety has in-house OBGYNs, and like medical doctors in-house at the facility, but they also contract with OBGYNs at Wake Med and at UNC Chapel Hill for like high-risk pregnancies. And so when I visited, like I saw the health wing where if there were a woman who were having a high-risk pregnancy or something going on, where that woman would be stationed and how they, you know, they have it set up for like virtual visits, but then people can come from Wake Med or UNC as well. So that's from the DPS side. County jails work with their departments of public safety, like the Guilford County, I'm from Guilford County. So the public health director works with the sheriff to have a health plan that includes what should be happening for pregnant and women who are pregnant while they're incarcerated. Now that plan, those plans, we looked at many of them, had a lot to be desired. So I'm glad that we will be having some more floor on what those plans must have once these bills are done. But that's what the current law structure is for all healthcare in prisons, but that, you know, women who are incarcerated while pregnant, that's also part of that structure, is my understanding. Kristie, add to or correct.
You have it right. That's exactly right on the prison side. It's right on the county side as well. In some counties, depends on how well resourced the county is or isn't. Like here in Mecklenburg, it's one of the most resourced counties in the state, the great state of Mecklenburg, as I like to call it, or as I like to believe that they are. You receive care through a contractor, and now let me just make a caveat about the contractor. Lots of the contracts that are held, lots of those companies give out very poor care. The most substandard care, lots of them have been sued on multiple occasions for, malpractice, wrongful death. And so it's just par for the course that medical care inside of a carceral facility is very, very basic. I think the most thing that surprises most people is that you have to convince people, whether it's a detention officer or a correction officer, you have to convince them that whatever you're facing right now is enough for them even to make that medical call. And even if they make that medical call can take anywhere from a few minutes to days. And that is not regulated. And so because we're relying on people who make $13 and $14 an hour to triage conditions, we end up with substandard conditions of incarceration around healthcare, around medical care inside. Again, I was inside for many months in a high-risk pregnancy and received absolutely no prenatal care. I never one time saw a doctor, except for one time I was being transported back to jail from my home because I had been on an ankle monitor, and they took me to the hospital to ensure that I was fit to be incarcerated. And so on my way in, they took me to make sure I was fit. But once I got there, I never saw a doctor until I got on the delivery table and had taken that plea just to get out. And just to be clear, I took the plea because I did not want to be shackled while pregnant, as so many people, and including my attorney, told me I would be. So, we could say a lot about medical care, but we just have to have care for humans. These are not chairs. These are not objects. This is not property. These are human beings who deserve dignity and compassion. And so the fact that we have to even state that, to legislate that, to me is very, very depressing, keeps me up at night. But I'm also hopeful when we have folks like Representative Clemmons and organizations like where Melissa works that continue to work towards a more just experience for not just incarcerated people, but for the communities, which then expands to the community at whole.
Absolutely. I'm so sorry to hear about your experience and the experience of so many women. Our next question, let's see. Is there any progress on restorative justice? Kristie, maybe just for our listeners who don't know, could you talk a little bit about what restorative justice is?
Sure. So restorative justice is a framework where folks who engage in harm and those who have been harmed engage in a restorative process. that oftentimes doesn't lead to incarceration. There are programs across the country. I would say one is Common Cause, if you haven't heard of Common Cause, out of New York. So they take victims of like severe violence, gunshots, rapes, stabbings, and they bring them together with the people who have harmed them, and they engage in a restorative process. And so the studies have shown that they have I want to say 98% success rate. Like the folks end up not having a criminal record, but they also end up not engaging in any criminal behavior for 5-7 years after, actually engage in community in really productive and beautiful ways, and oftentimes remain in community with the person that they've harmed. But further than restorative justice, that's just a step. I would say I would love to see transformative justice happen, where we no longer use punishment as a way of achieving the public safety that we say we want to achieve. And so I see restorative justice as a step on the way to transformative justice, where we really begin to abolish the oppressions, the poverty, the white supremacy, the anti-Blackness that exists that allow incarceration and mass incarceration to really thrive right now.
Absolutely.
Can I just add a quick thing there, Ashley?
Yeah,
I just kind of want to echo what Kristie said, that like, it is good to do restorative justice. And if the person who is incarcerated goes through that process and then has to sit for 10 or 12 or 15 more years in a not like, that restorative piece is lost if we expect them to hold it through being incarcerated for 10 to 12 to 15 or whatever more years. So some of these men in the Nash County facility have been doing a like pastorship, basically like a prison pastorship, and they're being trained and to be ministers to other people in prison, and that's wonderful. And they're having this life-changing experience and contributing to the community there, and are looking at the rest of their lives or 25 more years. And so I want to keep that in front of us, like restorative justice, it is good. And only as much as people can then move on as part of our society from that.
Absolutely. Well, we're reaching the end of the evening of our time. Before we go, I was just wondering if any of you have any closing thoughts for us about this legislation or the issues that addresses. Maybe Melissa, could we start with you if you have any?
Yeah, well, again, just to thank all of you. Thank you, Ashley and Kristen, for pulling this together, and for all of you who made some time this evening. Hopefully something tonight, right, caught your attention. It doesn't have to be everything, right? You don't even have to agree with everything, but what's the one thing that caught your attention tonight? That whenever I present a group, I always say, what are the 4 things you can do in the next week, right? They don't have to be big, but they have to be something. So I won't give you that homework assignment, but is there one thing that caught your attention tonight that you said, I need to tell someone, I need to do some research, I need to be in touch with someone, I need to read more, I need to figure out my feelings about it? What's that one thing, that one spark that you're going to walk away tonight and say, that's my homework. I won't ask you to report back, but pretend that I will, and to go forward with that and say, what's that one thing that I'm going to, that sparked my attention that I'm going to work on?
Representative Clemmons?
Thank you so much for having us, and to all of the people at Benevolence Farm for what you do. I will always say thank you to brave people like Kristie, who are willing to take their stories on the road and help all of us who haven't experienced it figure out a way to advocate and use our voices. And I think one of your homeworks should be visiting, if you have not been inside and talked with people who are incarcerated, that should be one of your homework, because and ask yourself, like, just morally and economically, what is our end goal, and is this that I'm seeing matching that? And I think if we all did that, not just on this topic and many topics, but particularly in this topic, and you go behind the walls, for those, many of us who haven't experienced it, it's a humbling thing. It really is. And so that would be the homework I would suggest everyone should do.
And Kristie, do you have any homework for us?
Yeah, I would say to connect on social media. If you don't follow me, to follow me on Instagram. I know, right? Instagram and Twitter. But just in general, and follow the ACLU to keep up with the work we're doing. I'm inviting everyone to come see me starting next week at the General Assembly. I will be there every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in the month of July. So please come if you live close by. If you need assistance getting there, reach out to me, K.Williams at ACLU-NC.org. We want to normalize normal everyday folks in that building, letting folks like Representative Clemmons know what they see, think, and feel about this issue and many more, so that they have a better perspective of what the community wants and how the community views things. And that's so helpful to them, and it's also helpful to us as advocates. So if you can come to the General Assembly, please do so. But if not, make sure you're signed up for our emails and stay connected to our campaign so that you can be a part of the work that we are in.
Very concretely, like on this actual bill, this bill is in the Senate Rules Committee right now. All of the legislative website, which is ncledge.gov, has all of the committees. So it will be in the Rules Committee. We need the Rules Chair to move it out to the Judiciary Committee so that there's a hearing in the Judiciary Committee and the Rules Chair to then bring it to the floor. So that's the process we need. So it's great. Reach out to any of your legislators, but those are like the key legislators to this bill right now getting across the finish line. So the Senate rules and Senate Judiciary are our gatekeepers right now. So they're, particularly if you're going to email across someone, that's who to look at.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you all so much for speaking with me tonight. It was really fantastic to hear your thoughts on such an important piece of legislation. Thank you to our audience as well for joining us and asking such amazing questions. We hope you all enjoyed hearing from our wonderful speakers. If you would like to keep up with the progress of HB 608 through the Senate, you can always look for it on ncledge.org. Like Representative Clemmons said, I think that Kristen posted that link in the chat. And again, if you support this bill, we highly encourage you to contact your state senators and ask them to support it as well. To keep up with the work of Benevolence Farm, you can visit benevolencefarm.org. If you want to learn more about Kristie Pucket-Williams and her work with the ACLU, you can visit acluofnorthcarolina.org. And to stay up to date with Melissa Radcliff's work with Our Children's Place, you can visit ourchildrensplace.com. And all of those links are in the chat if you're interested in checking those out. Thank you all again for joining us, and have a great evening.